This is Dr. Mike, and today we want to talk about the processes of cultural change. Anthropologists are interested not only in describing cultures and explaining how they have structured systems to adapt to the world that we live in, but they also want to understand why and how those cultures change. Change is one of those words that we don't like and we try to avoid as human beings, and yet we realize the change that's around us. We've talked about that a little bit in this course and what change does to human beings and to societies, and the change is so prevalent today that we see it on every hand. We see the changes that technology brings to a culture, your town that you live in, just moving a business away from your town or moving a business into your town brings about tremendous cultural change in the way that people operate. My best example of that would have been in 1996 when BMW Manufacturing, the car company, came to Greenville, South Carolina. South Carolina, Greenville, upstate, was still very backwoods and very much into the country culture, and BMW came in, hired over 5,000 people, but they also brought in all of their different spin-offs that make brake lines and wheel wells and engines and all those things. And so they brought $5 billion into the economy of South Carolina and jerked us, as I often say, kicking and screaming into the 21st century against our will. But it has greatly, the money and the jobs have greatly changed the culture of upstate South Carolina, at least. And now we have other car companies in the state. And so it's just been a ripple effect. And so these physical, technological changes often bring with them cultural changes that are worth talking about and worth thinking about and worth studying to see what they do to our own lives. In addition to technology, the demographics change, the markets change, the natural environment changes, or in people's perceptions. We learn to adapt to the world that we live in. You learn to adapt to greater traffic. You learn to adapt to, having to wait in line to go out to eat now because people are able to do that. So these are very important. When we talk about cultural change, we speak in terms of primary innovation. That is the creation, the invention, or the chance discovery of a completely new idea or method or device that will rapidly change the culture. The best example of that would have been in the early 1900s when, with the advent of the assembly line, Henry Ford, when he started building cars, could only build about 25 cars a week because they were very much a hand-built, hands-on process that every part was shaped and made. When he adopted the assembly line, he went from 25 a week to 500 a week. And that one process changed the face of manufacturing, not only in the automobile industry, but across industry in general. That was a primary innovation. Then secondary innovation, that is the deliberate application or modification of an existing idea, a method or device. And that also started in the early 1900s as an example, when they began to put business practices into play in the automobile manufacturing business. There really wasn't a lot of manufacturing until late 1800s. Prior to that, things were handmade. If you wanted clothing, you had to go to a seamstress, and they literally measured you and made you a garment that fit you exactly. There was no such thing as selling your old clothes at yard sales because, first of all, you didn't have many. You were blessed to have two outfits, one for special occasions and one for everyday use. But those clothes were made particularly for you, and they didn't fit anybody else. Along came the advent of the sewing machine and the being able to make clothes, and then you went to manufacturing, mass-producing clothes in factories and having them in for sale in department stores. That was a huge cultural change. Ladies thought that was just the height of, poor living to go and wear something off of a rack from Sears or J.C. Penney's that wasn't made for you. It didn't fit you perfectly. So it brought about cultural change. People had to get used to the idea of buying their clothing that way. Now hardly anybody has clothing made by a professional seamstress. But those were primary and secondary innovations. Then we talk about the idea of diffusion. And diffusion is how those certain ideas and customs and practices spread from one culture to another. In the 1980s, I was doing mission work in the Philippines, and I went out to a tribe that had barely seen a white man before. There had been missionaries there before me. What was really funny was that these were Baptist missionaries, and when I went to the service to speak, here they were living on dirt floors, no cell phone, no electricity, and couldn't speak English. And yet they were carrying a King James English version of the Bible to church, and the women were wearing blue jean jumpers, which is distinctively a Baptist thing from my own heritage. But you see the culture and the tradition had made it to where even, civilization hadn't been. What was even funnier was there was a Coca-Cola sign nailed to a tree in that jungle. So Coca-Cola and Pepsi are a cultural icon that move across the board to different areas of the world, and here they were in the middle of the jungles of the Philippines. So that's an idea of diffusion. The printing press moved from China to Europe and revolutionized printing and brought about the religious Reformation and brought about the Enlightenment. All of these seemingly innocuous things like technological changes bring about rapid changes to the world. The discovery of the caravel, which was a particular ship with a triangular sail, or the astrolabe, or the compass, those discoveries brought about tremendous change and brought about the age of exploration that ended up discovering America and everything that came out of that. So you can see diffusion. Technology and change tends to diffuse from one culture to another, and we study that. We look at, even in ancient times, we look at, say, Native American archaeology, and we see that they had a pot that was made, and they might have been in what is now California. They had a pot that was made in South America. How did that pot get there? It was diffused across cultural lines and traded and sold and all these other things. And so that is a very important part of this process of cultural change. We also talk in terms of cultural loss, the abandonment of an existing practice or trait. And cultures will do that all the time. They will abandon things that no longer work for something that does work. We don't still do handmade clothing because now you can buy it so much more cheaply off the rack at JCPenney's or whatever. Acculturation, the massive cultural change that occurs in a society when it experiences intensive first-hand contact with a more powerful society. We saw acculturation with the Native American tribes that were here when the early settlers came here because of guns and pots and gunpowder. All these things massively changed the Native American culture. Alcohol did massively change that culture, not always for the good. And then we talk about ethnocide, which is the violent eradication of an ethnic group's collective cultural identity as a distinctive people. It occurs when a dominant society deliberately sets out to destroy another society's cultural heritage. The best example we have of that is with the Holocaust, when the German Nazis determined that they were going to eradicate the Jewish culture. They killed over 6 million Jews in the death camps and concentration camps. And the Soviets killed over 9 million. Interesting that you don't hear much about that in history because of one simple thing, that is that the winners are the ones who write history, and Russia happened to be on the right side of history when that happened, so you don't hear as much about that. But the ethnocide, we talk about genocides, the wiping out of one culture by another, and that's basically what the Americans did to the Native American population. Was we attempted genocide, and we almost wiped out the Native American tribes. Accommodation or assimilation is when a cultural absorption of an ethnic minority by a dominant culture. Early people came to America in the 1800s from Italy, from Ireland, from Germany, all the Middle European countries. They brought their language with them. They ate their ethnic food. They dressed in a particular way. They worshiped in their churches they were used to back home. But within 2 generations, a lot of those cultures began to disappear and to assimilate into the surrounding culture. The Amish would be an example where that did not happen. But they have to fight, as we've talked about already, they have to fight continually to preserve their culture, to not be encroached upon by the surrounding culture. Think about just the absence of electricity in your home. How much pressure there would be for you to assimilate, and a lot of Amish people have done that. They've taken electricity and telephones and cars and all the things that they fought against all these years. We develop traditions within our culture. These are customary ideas, they're practices that are passed from generation to generation, which in a modernizing society may form an obstacle to new ways to do things. You and I that live in Appalachia, we understand that. Our traditions and our cultures tend to hinder us. We don't like change. We don't often like new ideas. We don't like to meet new people many times, and those things tend to hinder our progress. Whereas my grandmother used to say, we have our minds made up and we're not going to change them. But that can be a detriment in a culture to change. Accommodation in anthropology refers to an adaptive process by which a people resist assimilation by modifying their traditional culture in response to pressures from a dominant society in order to preserve its distinctive ethnic identity. So you have to work at accommodating. The Amish have to accommodate to survive. I had a friend that grew up in an Amish home, and he said he could never understand why they could have a phone in the barn, they couldn't have one in the house. Or when they needed to carry trees to the mill to have them sawed, they could hire somebody else's truck to take the logs to the mill. They just couldn't own the truck. Well, that's an example of accommodation. They do have certain things that they can do to get around that. Another interesting term is the term cargo cult, which is a spiritual movement, especially in some societies, in reaction to disruptive contact with American or Western capitalism, trying to go back to the old ways. We still see that sometimes with people, say for instance, that claim to be able to raise a dead relative or things like that. You want to go back to those old ideas, those myths, those things in the past. But it never quite works that way. My grandparents are a great example of that. They got in as they got older. They had grown up, working on the farm and not having all the electricity and things of life. So they decided they wanted to go back to a wood stove. And so wanted to cook their food on a wood stove like they had done in their earlier years. And they paid quite a lot of money to find a wood stove, to bring it home, to set it up on a Friday, and we're going to cook their food. We went up to visit on Sunday. The wood stove was gone. The electric stove was back. And that new $500 wood stove was out in the shed and was never used again. But that was an example of this cargo cult kind of thing, wanting to go back to the past, the good old days. My mom always said that people that talk about the good old days apparently never lived through them, because they really weren't as good as we think they are. We always want to go back to the old ways, thinking that somehow they were wonderful and there was a panacea. But in this idea of cultural change, that is something to really think about. Sometimes within the culture, ideas like these will surface. We'll have an insurgency or maybe even a revolution. People overthrow governments based upon cultural change and ideas. And what does it take for people to get to the point of wanting to overthrow a culture, overthrow a government? A lot of times it's this idea of change that can't be controlled. The idea of modernization is another major issue. There are people that are against modernizing. They like the old ways. They're happy without change. And finally, I want to mention just something in passing about disease. One of the major changes today is that we have all these new diseases, or that are resistant diseases to the medications that we have. One of the byproducts of technological and cultural change is that these things adapt themselves. Tuberculosis is one example. It was almost eradicated. Now we have all these superbugs that are resistant to penicillin, resistant to the drugs that we have to stop them. So part of this idea of cultural change and modernization brings with it a negative side. That's what I want to leave you with today. Technology always has a downside. When you listen to TV, they talk about a certain drug, and they spend most of the commercial telling you how that drug is going to kill you. Then you realize that pill is a technology. While it may help you with this problem, it's going to hurt your liver. It's going to do all these other things. Cholesterol medication is a prime example of that. They always do liver testing to see if it's destroying your liver. So cultural change, there's always two sides to it. There's a positive side, a side we should want, and then we realize there's always a negative side. Change brings consequences. So I hope you'll read this chapter very carefully and look at these things and think about them. Thank you.